Hi, everybody. Welcome and thanks for joining me. I'm Doug Billings. This is The Simple Life. For the last couple of days, we've been talking about the Founding Fathers, and in particular, their principles, the principles that they all held and helped to formulate the United States of America. We began by talking about the very first principle that they held in common, and that states that the only reliable basis for sound government and just human relations is natural law, and we began to define natural law. The Founding Fathers' definition of natural law went way back to the writings of Cicero, which is where we're going to pick up today, and we were about ready to talk about the divine gift of reason. You see, to Cicero, it was obvious and remarkable that man had been endowed with a rich quality of life and of mind that does not exist among other forms of life, except in perhaps the most minuscule of proportions, right? Between man and other creatures, there's a gigantic gap as far as mental processes are concerned. And Cicero, as well as the Founding Fathers, viewed this as a special divine endowment from the Creator. In fact, Cicero specifically said, "And reason, when it is full grown and perfected, is rightly called wisdom. Therefore, since there is nothing better than reason, and since it exists both in man and God, the first common possession of man and God is reason. But those who have reason in common must also have right reason in common. And since right reason is law, we must believe that men have law in common with God. Furthermore, those who share law must also share justice, and those who share these are to be regarded as members of the first commonwealth. If indeed they obey the same authorities and powers, it's true to a far greater degree that, as a matter of fact, they obey the same celestial system and the divine mind. They offer an obedience to the divine mind and the God of transcendent power, and hence we have to now admit that this whole universe is one commonwealth of which both God and man are members." Those come directly from the notes of Cicero, and the Founding Fathers believed firmly in them. In fact, I think that if you listen closely to what he was saying, Cicero's saying that both God and man are the first members of the greatest commonwealth of all. I think, ladies and gentlemen, that phrase and that sentiment, that line of thought, is as important as anything written in the Bible, and the Founding Fathers thought so too. You see, what Cicero was coming around to was his discovery of the first great commandment. He had comprehended the magnificence of the first great commandment to love, respect, obey the all-wise Creator. He put this precept into proper perspective by saying that God's law is right reason. And when it's perfectly understood, it's called wisdom. When applied by government in regulating human relations, it's called justice. When people unite together in a covenant or a compact under law, they become the true commonwealth. And since they intend to administer their affairs under God's law, they belong to His commonwealth. So Cicero came to what Jews and Christians call the first great commandment. You remember the story in Matthew? Remember this. It was Matthew 22, 36 through 40, when a young lawyer tried to discredit and embarrass Jesus by asking him, "Master, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Now, of course, there were hundreds of commandments. And the question, as I said, wasn't designed so much to get an answer, but designed to embarrass Jesus. But Jesus simply said, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment." So the lawyer was amazed and astonished at the quick and ready response from the simple carpenter, right? But Jesus wasn't done yet. He added, "And the second commandment is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments," said Jesus, "hang the law and the prophets altogether." Jesus had chosen from teachings in his own life what he considered to be the foremost commandments from Deuteronomy 6, verse 4 through 5, to love God above everything else, and then what he considered the second most important commandment, that to love your neighbor as yourself, from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. So what's interesting to me is that Cicero was not a Jew, he was not a Christian. Yet he was able to discover the power and fundamental significance of obedience not only to the first great commandment, but to the second one as well. He had an amazing mind that instinctively led him to comprehend the beauty and felicity of what Jesus had identified as the second great commandment. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And he makes, Cicero does, another connection with justice. He points out that justice is impossible except under the principles of God's law. So to Cicero, the glue which holds a body of human beings together in the commonwealth of a just society is love. Love of God first, and love of God's love of a law of justice, and love of our fellow man, which provides the desire to promote true justice among all. The Founding Fathers bought into this completely, and it was one of the first principles among their construction of what would become the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and our Republic. Now, Cicero also said, and we can't really end our discussion before we talk about this, that the definition of natural law has to include a warning to legislators who try to pass laws that violate the laws of nature and of nature's God. Cicero said to do this, we have to set forth means that would measure all laws against God's law. We can't pass laws that violate God's law. Cicero also emphasized that the essence of an evil law can't be mended through ratification of the legislature or by popular opinion, and justice can never be expected from laws that arbitrarily are passed in violation of standards that are set up under the laws of nature and the Creator. So Cicero's conclusion, it was clear to him that as he came towards the end of his life, he thought that we had to eliminate the depravity that had lodged itself into society. He felt that we had to return to a high road of natural law, that we had to pledge obedience to the mandates of a loving and concerned Creator. And he thought that there was such a huge promise and what unprecedented wonder awaited that future society who would take up those means. And the Founding Fathers, when they read this, decided they were going to create or attempt to create such a society. They, the American founders, believed it, and they embraced the obvious necessity of building a highly moral and virtuous society. You see, the founders wanted to lift mankind from the common depravity and the cheating of all the past civilizations that they've come from, and to lay the foundation for a new kind of civilization built on freedom of the individual, and prosperity for the whole Commonwealth. This is why they built their system on natural law. Examples of natural law are everywhere, but to Americans, to most of us, I bet we'd be surprised at how much of our Constitution and our very lifestyle are based in natural law. For example, the concept of unalienable rights is based on natural law. The concept of unalienable duties is based on natural law. There's a whole smattering of duties that really we're not very familiar with, but according to the Founding Fathers, we had unalienable duties to honor the Creator and His laws, unalienable duties to not take the life of another unless it's in self-defense, the duty to be honest in all transaction, the duty to be temperate, and the duty to perform civic responsibilities and such. Those are just a few examples that show us how extensively our entire American culture is entrenched and grounded in natural law. In fact, when we realize that natural law is the foundation and the framework for everything that we've come to know, we know now why it's called the People's Law. This is exactly what Thomas Jefferson meant when he wrote in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The famous phrase right there from America's initial Charter of Liberty is based primarily on presuppositions of natural law. So this is the Founding Fathers' first guiding principle, that the only reliable basis for sound government and just human relationships is natural law. Thanks for watching. That concludes part 2 of the founders' first principle. We'll talk about their second principle next time. That principle is called "A free people cannot survive under a republican constitution unless they remain virtuous and morally strong." Look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for listening. I'm Doug Billings. So long.